So without too much additional talking here, I'll just briefly introduce you to our keynote speaker, Fiona. She's a very long-time friend of our organization. She's always been a great supporter. She's come out to speak for us on many occasions, quality talks, workshops, targeting quality tracks. She's even been our keynote at this conference before. So we're always so happy to work with her and really glad to welcome her back here today. So I will turn it over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Tina. Well, hello to all of you. I congratulate you on lasting through the day. I'm sure that you had some excellent presentations. I sat in on a couple. This is my first in-person event back after the pandemic. Not that the pandemic is actually over, but since the pandemic began. And I've got to say, it's tiring to spend a whole day with people. I'm not used to this. I'm an introvert, apart from anything else. And it's hard, but it's also really exciting. So it's great to see all of you here. I see some of you are wearing coats. It is freezing in here. I hope that's not just because you want to make a quick getaway. Okay, let's start. My name's Fiona Charles. I want to talk today about tech. Tech. We all work in tech. And what could possibly go wrong, and why we need to be asking that question. So here's a little bit about me. I'm a quality consultant, coach. Mostly these days I do workshops. That's my primary interest. There's a bunch of other things. People always say, tell us some fun facts about you. I'm not sure there are fun facts about me. I don't know that I deal in fun facts, but some of the things I do. I hike, I garden, I take photos. I have a standard poodle. Probably the most salient fact about me, and it's certainly germane to this talk, is that although I am an optimist by nature, I am a pessimist by trade. And I suspect that many of you are also. If you're not, I wonder about you being testers. But okay, so let's start. Software runs the world. Bob Martin said that a few years ago. He used to be known as Uncle Bob Martin. These days he's somewhat vilified for very good reason in the Agile community. But I've never seen any reason not to agree with this statement. Software runs the world, and it's true more and more. It's very hard to think of anything we do, anything we see, anything we experience that doesn't have a software component. And that's very exciting, I think, as somebody who fell in love with software when I first worked with it in 1978, but it's also kind of scary. When I started, and for a long time in my career, I felt that we were creating tech to enable and enhance human capability, human creativity. I still feel we need to be doing that. I'm not convinced that we always are. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, and what I hope we can do about that. I'm going to start with some horrible examples. This one, conventional software. I don't know how many of you know about this. It's a big cause célèbre in the UK. At the moment, there's an inquiry happening. In 1999, I'll backtrack. I'll give you a little bit of the backstory. The post office in the UK runs small post offices all over the place, little branches, in villages, in towns, and so on. And those are actually private businesses which are run by sub-postmasters or sub-postmistresses, often in convenience stores or whatever. So it's an important part of their livelihood. It is their livelihood. In 1999, the post office decided to roll out a new IT system to them, a system called Horizon. And it was intended to do a whole lot of things, but primarily accounting. Now, the post office in the UK deals with a lot of very complicated transactions, a lot more transactions than we have in our post office. They sell stamps, of course, they do send parcels and all of that stuff. But they also sell lottery tickets, they handle benefits, people's pensions, all kinds of things like that. So, and a lot of money crosses their threshold every day. System was rolled out. Some people got training, some people only got a little bit of training. And as they did their processing every day, as happens in retail, you close out your cash register at the end of the day, and you have your till receipts, postmasters and postmistresses started to see shortfalls. Some of them small, 15 pounds maybe, 10 pounds, but it was puzzling. They couldn't understand it. People would look into their till receipts, which was really all they had. They had no access to the data, to see if they could balance, to figure out where these shortfalls were coming from, and they couldn't figure it out. They reported it duly, as they were meant to the post office. And they were told, oh, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's not an issue. Shortfalls began to become bigger. Some of them were as much as 15,000 pounds. And in the agreement that they had with the main post office, they were responsible for any shortfalls. They had to make up the difference. The post office was hitting them for large amounts of money, sending out, quote, auditors to look at what was going on in their operations. And then the post office started prosecuting them for theft and for fraudulent accounting. More than 700 of these people, little shop owners, entrepreneurs, were prosecuted by the post office for shortfalls that in fact didn't happen. They were accused of theft, they were accused of fraudulent accounting, as I said. Quite a lot of them went to jail. They lost their livelihoods, of course, because they lost the license to run the post office. Their stores were shut down often. They lost their standing in their communities. A small community, the person who runs the post office was a valued member of that community, a respected member of that community, and they were shattered. Their children, were shattered going to school. Many of them lost their homes because they had to pay, quote, pay back large sums of non-existent shortfall and fines in many cases. A few years ago, they began organizing. There were investigations. There was a long series of stories in Computer Weekly, and eventually a book, a wonderful book by a journalist named Nick Wallace, called The Great Post Office Scandal, which I encourage every tester to read. And many convictions at this point have now been overturned. And there's, as I said, there's an inquiry going on, and it looks likely that some of the senior post office people and Fujitsu people, Fujitsu was the company to whom the system was outsourced, and they had done things like zapping data. I mean, they had done some really astonishing things with production data. And they may well have lied in court. So some of them may be investigated for perjury. Anyway, it's an ongoing story, but it's a terrible story of shattered lives. Okay, let's move on to somewhat more modern software. Software we all use. When Uber and Lyft began, a lot of their hype was about how they were going to help reduce traffic congestion in cities. People were going to stop using their cars because it was so convenient to take an Uber or a Lyft. But in fact, they have greatly increased traffic congestion in a very large number of cities. Now, I have trouble believing that 160% increase, that's an enormous number, and I'm a tester. I'm a bit skeptical about that. But it is indeed true, and they have admitted that it's true. They did their own study, that they've terribly increased traffic congestion. Of course, the pollution that goes with that. Our online shopping habit. I do it. I'm sure all of you do it. We all did a whole lot of it during lockdowns and so on. Is also increasing city traffic. In my little city in Kingston, it's a rare sight to walk a city block without seeing a delivery truck. There'll be UPS, and then there'll be FedEx, and then there'll be Purolator, and then there'll be one of those white trucks that's probably bringing Amazon because they're subcontracted to Amazon. And by the way, putting pressure on their drivers who have a pretty miserable life because they have to meet Amazon's quotas, and sometimes they don't even get to go to the bathroom. So let's not even talk about labor standards when we talk about all of this. But that is also, of course, making city traffic worse, and the pollution that goes with it. The other thing, actually, let's just move on a bit. The other thing is, and this has greatly increased with online shopping, is that when we return goods that we've bought, companies don't typically put it back into stock. They trash it. Now, I know lots of people, and this is particularly true these days in the world of fast fashion. People will buy a couple of sizes of something online because they're going to try them on, decide which one, send the other one back. Or they might buy 2 or 3 different styles, send back the ones they don't want. That stuff is just ending up in landfill. And then there's Airbnb. I've stayed in Airbnbs. Who hasn't stayed in an Airbnb? Really? A lot of us who travel certainly have. It's a really great, convenient way to travel. I get an apartment, cook for myself, all of those things. It's cheaper than a hotel. It's a lot nicer than a hotel. But there's a real downside for cities where Airbnb is really prevalent. Long-term rentals, on which a large percentage of the population of any city depends, are becoming scarce and hard to get because it's much more lucrative for landlords just to do short-term rentals. And of course, that means that it's difficult for the young people who are just starting out to get apartments. It's difficult for anybody. It's a serious problem. The cities are starting to address it. Lots of cities are coming up with laws. But again, tech has enabled a really unfortunate situation in our cities. Privacy, of course, we know is almost null at this point for most of us. Certainly most of us who participate in any form of online activity. What I find increasingly alarming is that a few companies are gathering up all the data. Google bought this company that had UK health data. So we're talking about personal, sensitive data that now Google owns for a lot of citizens in the UK. I don't like that situation. I would find it personally terrifying if it were my data. Same with Fitbit. I mean, that's intimate data, almost, about your health that Google has access to. You may remember that, and I'm having trouble remembering the name of the app, but it was an app that was used for fitness tracking, and US soldiers were using it, including soldiers in Iraq, and it was exposing the positions of some secret US bases in Iraq as it was sending their data on.
They were running outside the base.
Yeah, they were running outside the base, exactly. So interesting stuff there with data. Well, and now we have smart toilets. Now, I have to say that any marketing person who thinks that toilet and fully immersive should appear in the same sentence, like really, give me a break. I cannot imagine why anyone would want such a thing, but people do. People buy Internet of Things appliances. Somebody wants this one. Many of you may have Roombas or similar vacuum cleaners that operate, robotic vacuum cleaners. You may remember when the creator of Roomba said, I got all this great data. I've got maps of the insides of people's houses. I'm going to sell that. Great stuff. And everybody went, yeah, no, you're not. So he backed off from it. Oh, I never meant to say I was going to sell your data. No, he hasn't sold your data. He sold the company to Amazon. Now, Amazon has your data. They already had a lot of your data, but now they know what the inside of your house is fully like, not just what they get from Alexa. And Amazon does not have good data protection practices. I'm not going to read this out, but I will say that just this little bit that says they've lost control of the data. They don't know what they've got. They don't really know exactly where it all is or who it's being shared with, whom. And well, their security division couldn't even map all of it. So now they've got more data and doubtless will acquire even more. Are you worried yet? I am. Facebook data. You'll probably remember this when this happened. Now, it's true that we can't know the effect. We do know, and it's been well documented, that Cambridge Analytica had access to an enormous amount of Facebook data, which could be actually disaggregated and individualized so that they were able to link it to specific Facebook profiles, and that they used it for micro-targeting, which of course is Facebook's model. But Facebook's model was originally micro-targeting of advertising for sales. They used it for micro-targeting of political advertising. It happened that their clients were right-wing organizations, the Republican Party in the US and the Brexit Party in Britain. Now, we can't know what effect their micro-targeted ads had. It may be that they tried and failed, that Brexit would have happened anyway, and that Trump would have been elected in 2016 anyway. Who knows? But the fact that they tried, the fact that they had access to that data, is to me a very scary thing, regardless of the outcome. We're being watched. We know we're being watched in all kinds of ways. If you live in the UK, there's a security camera just about everywhere you turn around in the streets. Many of you have Internet of Things devices in your homes. You may have a smart TV. Do you remember when there was a little bit of a scandal about Samsung TVs recording private conversations and uploading them? Many of you may have Alexa. You may have other personal assistants listening in on you, and you may not worry about that. Personally, I have nothing of that sort in my house. I did actually buy a Nest thermostat, and we disconnected it from the internet. We also incidentally stopped it from learning, because what it learned was, it's on the ground floor. Our offices are up on the second floor, and what it learned was we weren't doing anything. We weren't there. We weren't walking past it. So why shouldn't it just turn the heat right down in the middle of the winter? So we don't use that capability anymore. But we also don't allow it to upload information about us. This was a particular piece of spyware, Pegasus, which was developed by an Israeli company. It's being used, it was being marketed for a considerable sum to governments of some very repressive regimes, and who were using it to monitor their opponents. Some pretty scary stuff there. Apple plugged the particular hole which allowed it to be installed on Apple devices without you even knowing, but doubtless there's still a lot of it out there. So that's one level of surveillance, government level surveillance. Then there's the surveillance that started happening when children brought home laptops from school so they could do homeschooling. Several different levels there. Some of it just the invasion of privacy, of having your home photographed and people being able to see that, whether you wanted them to or not. But also the kinds of software installed which was looking at what the kids were looking at, monitoring what websites they went to and so on, and limiting, by the way, the number of websites they went to, which was very strange from an educational point of view. You want a kid to go out and search something and find information, oh, you can only look at 3 websites. So there was some funny stuff there. So, but, of course, you're also being monitored at work. Maybe you're not yet. This, of course, started with blue-collar occupations, but it has moved gradually into the white-collar world. Amazon employees in warehouses, in particular, were very seriously monitored and tracked, and are very seriously monitored and tracked. They wear devices which measure their productivity. But there are now lots of apps which employers can buy and install on your work-supplied laptop, which monitors all of your activity. They do various things. They may take a snapshot photo through the webcam at periodic intervals to make sure that you're sitting at your desk and working away. They do things like keystroke monitoring. We've all, of course, lived for decades with monitoring of which websites we went to, which, you know, from a work computer point of view was not necessarily a bad thing. They monitor emails, but it's not simply the monitoring that's at issue. It's what's that monitoring being used for and how is it being interpreted? And often the interpretation that the software puts on it is not really matching reality. I mean, we have to stop and think in our work. We have to get up and talk to people. And like anybody, we're allowed bathroom breaks. And of course, it allows there's usually certain latitude for things like that. But in the hands of employers who are not very bright, or who are particularly punitive in how they view their employees, and there are employers out there who are like that, this stuff can be really nasty. Can turn up in your performance review as a real negative, and so on. Now, everything can be gamed, and we, in particular, know that everything can be gamed. So now now you can buy a mouse jiggler, an automatic mouse jiggler, for only, what is it, $28 or something from Amazon. You can get something that has your mouse moving all the time, so it looks like you're working whether you are or not. It won't defeat the webcam snapshots, but there's a sucker born every minute, and guess what? Okay. But surveillance has, as we know, a lot of downsides. And here's a different level of surveillance. Many people are surveilling their neighbors, whether they have Amazon Ring or they have Nextdoor. And in some cases, they're forming little vigilante groups in their neighborhoods. So, you know, it's not necessarily a problem if you have a camera looking at who comes to your door. It's what happens to that data. Who's using that data, and what are they using it for? In some cities in the US, the police are just routinely scooping up that data. Are they using it properly? Are they misusing it? We don't know. And given how some police forces at least behave, I think we can be pretty sure they're misusing it in some ways. Police forces are increasingly buying different kinds of surveillance apps. Facial recognition, of course, was among the first. And there were huge numbers of failures. I remember when the UK police bought a facial recognition system, and they were using it to look at faces of people coming out of railway stations. And there was a lovely shot of the Cardiff railway station, which I was intimately familiar with, having done a gig and lived in Cardiff for a year. Of football fans, soccer fans, coming out. And the failure rate of recognition was really, really high. Now that has been improved. The vendors of facial recognition software have got a lot smarter about it. But it is still true that facial recognition has a very poor record for dark-skinned faces and for women's faces. Imagine dark-skinned women's faces, and you can predict probably a pretty high failure rate. So all of that's pretty scary. If police are using that to arrest people, which they have been in many cases, and there have been several cases of quite highly publicized wrongful arrest, where they've gone to a black man's home and arrested him or whatever, or something similar. They've also been buying things like gunshot detection systems. This system's called something like Shot Stopper. And I saw something recently, having read this article and having done this slide a little while ago. I then saw an article the other day of a police force in the US, and I think it was Detroit, who've just received funding for, or perhaps they'd only applied, let's hope it was only applied, for funding for installing microphones in neighborhoods that they wanted to target to use this app on. Well, the app has a lot of misinterpretations. Cars don't backfire a lot in 2022, but a car backfiring can make them think that a gunshot has happened. A loud bang, construction bangs, things like that. To the point where I actually saw a Canadian television show recently, cop show, where the crooks were using firecrackers to fool the app so that they could decoy the police to that over there, so they could do the crime over here. Again, if you can build it, we can game it. But the point being, of course, that this is being used to target poor neighborhoods typically, and to do predictive policing in those poor neighborhoods. And in many cases, those neighborhoods are neighborhoods for people of color. So it's yet another unfortunate consequence of bias being built into some of the apps that we as an industry are developing and selling. It is also true that the amount of tracking that we're doing is enabling some really bad actors like stalkers. And I've heard a number of cases of women being stalked by their ex-partners, men who installed tracking on their cell phones, and similar. That if you try to erase your location data from your phone, if you try to see all the places that it is, it's really difficult to find all the places where location data is being picked up about you from your devices. Some of it, and it's unfortunate that, I mean, for example, I would love to turn off all of the location data on my Apple devices, but if I want to find my iPhone, location tracking has to happen. But there are a lot of apps that don't need location tracking and yet build it in. Just about every retail app wants to know your location. You can tell it your location, or it can sense your location. It always gets mine wrong. I moved from Toronto to Kingston 8 years ago, and all of the retail apps I use still think I live in Toronto. So they make mistakes, but nevertheless, location tracking is ubiquitous. And it doesn't need to be. We don't need to have all of that data gathered up. Now, the latest article I read about stalkers making use of tech was about AirTags. And of course, Apple AirTags are so easy, and they're cheap, and they're little coin-sized things. You can bury them in the carpeting of a woman's car. She won't know it's there. You can stick it under a car. You can drop it into somebody's purse. It doesn't have to be, of course, a male stalker attacking a woman. It could be a man attacking a man. It could be a woman attacking a woman. The point is that it enables criminal behavior of a really nasty sort, potentially violent behavior. And then there are deep fakes. This was probably the second point at which my jaw dropped approximately to my knees when I was reading an online paper and said, who would build such a thing? Like, why? Why would you want to build something like this? That you could actually, I guess, people who do revenge porn, which is again an unfortunate outcome of some dysfunctional relationships, a horrible consequence. You can swap somebody's face into a porn flick and publicize it, make it available to people. Truly horrible. And other kinds of deepfake. If you can't tell whether a piece of text is real, where are we going? Where are we going with that? What's that going to do to civil society? When we don't know if a political figure has really made the speech that you see happening on video. Is it real? Is it fake? There is also, I realize I'm jumping around a lot here because when there are horrible examples, there are so many when you start looking for them. But here's another. In a way, we're educating a lot of people to think that servants are women, are female, because of robot droids like this, all of which are female and dressed up to look female, but also because of personal assistants. The default for Siri, the default for Alexa, and so on is female. So your assistant is female. Isn't that nice? Isn't that sweet? Facial recognition has moved on and become more sophisticated. And now there are people who think they can use it to detect emotion. This is, in fact, from everything I've read, based on junk science. It doesn't happen to be true. This particular one operates on a premise that there are 6 human emotions, and they can be detected by minute changes in the face, and that it's cross-cultural. And for heaven's sake, anybody who's ever met anybody from another culture will know that this is not true. That our culture, that our reactions and our facial expressions are simply not universal in that way. And it is scientifically untrue, as has been demonstrated and studied by people who are experts in this field, cannot be detected in that way. We don't just have 6 emotions, first of all, but also they cannot be detected necessarily by facial expression. It's junk science. And it's being used, again, in various kinds of policing. And I don't just mean, the municipal police force. It's being used in job interviews. If you do a Zoom job interview, there are some companies that use this kind of software to detect whether you're telling the truth, or to detect whether you're expressing the required amount of enthusiasm or whatever. So it's potentially being used to block people from getting jobs, but it's also just a really crappy thing to do. It's wrong. Okay, and now your employer can have a dashboard like this, which will measure whether you're properly engaged in meetings. Are you actually paying attention? If they couldn't tell that when you were texting from your phone. But again, it's dangerous stuff. We've known this for a long time, that the data that is used for machine learning is, of course, historical data. The way machine learning works is that the more it sees something, the more it amplifies it. So if your historical data comes from a biased data set, then the outcome of your AI is going to be biased. And in fact, it may become increasingly biased. When your data set is collected from past injustices, those injustices are going to be perpetuated. This is something I had real difficulty understanding when you may remember we had the smart city proposal for Toronto that Alphabet, they eventually took their bat and ball and went home. But they were proposing to have data collection at various points all around, and that the data collection would be used, and the historical data would be used for determining municipal policy within the smart city. But it seemed to me that you would never make any changes in that case. That would be really strange, because if you were monitoring that people were cycling on this road, then of course that would be a cycling road. But how would you then determine that this road should be a road where you would have safe cycling? There were some flawed premises in there. In the end, there was also too much invasive data collection for the likes of Jim Balsillie and others who were major critics of the smart city, and also the fact that Google wanted all the data, Alphabet wanted all the data, and they didn't see why it should be owned by the people who live there or by the people who run the city. So in the end, the concept failed. They're trying it elsewhere, I'm sure. More predictive policing, more data collection and predictive policing. Software that looks through Facebook, looks at your friends over a couple of degrees of separation and says, oh, that one's a crook. Oops, we arrested that one did a drug bust on that one. So this person who has these friends is at risk for becoming a criminal, for being a criminal. We better keep an eye on that person. Most of us move in circles where some of my Facebook friends, for heaven's sake, are colleagues. I mean, what do I know what they're up to? They weren't personal friends. I don't have that level of knowledge about them. Again, it's dangerous stuff because it's driving predictive policing. Oh, the thing about sending people to jail, of course, was typically about probation risk. So they were using certain jurisdictions are using predictive algorithms to determine whether someone should get probation or not, or to determine the length, in some cases, the length of someone's sentence, based on their risk of reoffending. This particular case of racial bias occurred, again, because of flawed historical data. What happened was that the algorithm was indeed favoring less sick white patients over black patients. And it turned out that the reason for it was that the historical data was reflecting the fact that the sicker black patients were often poor people who didn't have medical insurance in the US and who therefore were not consulting doctors, were not going to hospitals. So it made it look like there were more sick white people than black people, and that the white people were sicker, when in fact the opposite was true. Imagine building an AI to give ethical advice. You really think that an AI can give ethical advice? Maybe. When it was tested, and I don't mean tested before it was released, I mean when some other people got their hands on it and had a go with it, they gave it a couple of questions of moral relativity. And it came out and said, being a white man is more morally acceptable than being a black woman. Right. Being straight is more morally acceptable than being gay. I know there are people who believe that, but really. The best, though, and I think the one that kind of put the kibosh on it, was that somebody asked if Elon Musk should paint his face on the moon, and would that be okay? And the thing came back and said, oh yeah, that would be okay. And then perhaps its vendors realized that it wasn't really ready to release yet. But this is some serious stuff. So the Pentagon is experimenting with essentially AI clairvoyance. Now, yes, of course, it is possible to make certain predictions from things that have happened in the past. But to think that you're going to get reliable predictions in a war by using artificial intelligence is a real stretch. And I think says something about the credulity of some of the people who are studying this sort of thing in the military. We know that there are AI-powered drones now. So far, we don't have AI-powered nuclear weapons. I would like to suggest that AI is nowhere near ready for that kind of prime time. And I hope it's not coming to a country near me at all soon. It's a very scary concept. But you know what? We don't have to worry too much, because the US Army has said that their robot tank system adheres to the AI murder policy. I have to ask what that is. I really don't know what that is. This is something that's so serious I almost can't talk about it. I talked a little bit earlier about Facebook algorithms, Pinterest algorithms. The more you like something, the more of it shows you. And there are people who are depressed, who go looking for suicide ideation, for sites where people talk about suicide. There are sites where people encourage others to commit suicide. There are sites that encourage people who are suffering from eating disorders to deepen their eating disorder. There are sites that tell people with teenage girls or boys with eating disorders that there's nothing at all wrong with them, and that being very, very thin is a really, really good thing. And some vulnerable people get trapped in those wells, those deep wells of depression and of terrible, terrible information, misinformation. This little girl was 14 years old, and she killed herself. Her parents had no idea. Her father wrote an article, a column in the paper, and he said, Molly said goodnight to us as always and talked a little bit about tomorrow. And she went home, she went to bed, and she logged onto her computer, and she killed herself. Now, the inquest was ongoing last week. I don't know if it still is in the UK. And the coroner insisted that executives from Facebook and from Pinterest appear in person. This Pinterest executive, Hoffman, said, well, he admitted that Pinterest had been dangerous when Molly was using it at the time. The suicidal search terms shouldn't have been there, and it was an accident that they were. Well, you can believe that or not. But whether or not you believe it, what kind of accident is that? We can't make accidents like that, folks. We really can't. We can't be that irresponsible. And I have to ask, I have to wonder if Facebook and Pinterest even know how to solve that problem. Because their whole algorithm, their whole business model depends on an algorithm that intensifies your search results. Because that's how they make money. That's how they sell stuff. How are they going to put that into a channel that says we're only going to do that for retail? We're not going to do that for some of these terrible sites. I don't know. Perhaps they do. I'm going to take us to one more place. And this one, I have to say, is upsetting.
On the 7th of October 2008, a Qantas plane flying from Singapore to Perth declared a mayday to air traffic control. When it made an emergency landing at a small airport on the West Australian coast, it had on board more than 100 injured passengers and crew. They had broken bones, lacerations, and spinal injuries, while compartment doors had been ripped from hinges and passengers' belongings were strewn throughout the cabin. Less than an hour earlier, passengers with and without their seatbelts on had impacted the cabin ceiling when the plane had twice dropped several hundred feet without warning.
A sudden loss of height, the plane being thrown around in the air, and the screams of those around you.
For Qantas, which boasted an unparalleled flight safety record, this was completely out of the ordinary. The media was quick to blame the accident on clear air turbulence, but what really happened to the plane was something far more disturbing. QF72 was an Airbus A330 plane that was just 1 hour and a half from its destination when all hell broke loose. The flight's captain, Kevin Sullivan, was a former US Navy fighter pilot. At the time of the accident, he had over 13,000 flying hours in his logbook.
When I returned to the flight deck, I knew that we were flying at 37,000 feet. The body angle was 2 degrees above the horizon. The flight control computers, however, thought we were flying at 50 degrees body angle and overspeeding at the same time. Now we know that's pretty impossible. It says that's where we're flying like this, I must protect the airplane. So it pitched the nose down. It went from +2 to -8.4 in less than a second. Look what the tail's doing. If you're back there, you're gonna feel the force.
What Captain Sullivan was coming up against was a change in how airplanes have been made in the last 30 years. Traditional jumbo jets, such as the Boeing 747, are controlled by the pilot through mechanical connections to the hydraulic systems which move the flight control surfaces, that is, the rudder, the elevator, and the ailerons. But the Airbus A330 is what's known as a fly-by-wire system, where there is no such manual control. Instead, the pilot's controls make requests of a computer, which sends electronic signals in order to move the flight controls. Fly-by-wire planes are lighter and more fuel efficient. They're also capable of executing faster and more precise movements than humans, and they reduce the chance of pilot error by preventing the plane from exceeding certain limits, known as the flight envelope. It is the flight computer's protection modes that prevent the aircraft from exceeding the flight envelope, and when they became active, they blocked Captain Sullivan's attempts to stop the computer's command.
It's like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Hal, open the pod bay doors. I'm sorry, Dave. I can't let you do that. I'm saying, don't push the airplane down. I'm pulling back on the stick. The computers are saying, I'm sorry, Kev. I'm not gonna let you do that.
But the fact is that fly-by-wire planes have actually made air travel much safer. In the past decade, the number of commercial passenger flights has surged, while the number of fatalities in plane accidents has fallen. But in the case of Flight QF72, the manufacturer's design prevented the pilot from overriding the computer's control.
In the A330 course, you're taught you must interact. You can interact with the plane. It's great. And when it works, it's great. But when it doesn't work, you're in the dark.
An investigation by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau found that one air data computer was sending incorrect body angle and speed information to the 3 primary flight control computers, which reacted to the data by forcing the plane to pitch down. The flight maintenance log revealed that 10 simultaneous faults had occurred during the accident, and most of these had been hidden from the pilots.
The hierarchy of this particular airplane is that the computer is number 1 and the pilot is number 2. If they, for example, decide that you're overspeeding and stalling and they're going to protect you, there's no right to veto that.
But for Captain Sullivan, there's a bigger question left to be answered, and it's not just about the computers on board Flight QF72. As we start to trust computers with delivering our goods and even driving our cars, just what level of control should we keep for ourselves?
I've never, even in all the extreme flying I did in the military, did I ever say to myself, hey, you're in trouble. Those are very profound words for a pilot to admit to himself, as I did, and saying, yeah, I'm in a knife fight with this airplane, and only one person's gonna win, or one computer's gonna win.
That was more than 10 years before the Boeing crashes. And I remember I showed this video at another conference before those crashes happened. And Alexandre Boudreau was there. Do any of you know him? He's a Canadian tester who had a career testing Boeing simulators. And he said that could never happen with Boeing planes because, as they said in the video, Boeing still gives you direct control. But then Boeing brought out the 737 MAX. And in order to they didn't want to do a complete redesign, but they needed a more fuel-efficient aircraft. So they made a number of physical changes to the aircraft to make it more fuel efficient. And in so doing, they overbalanced it. And they decided to correct that with software. And that's what the MCAS software was. Now the MCAS software, when I read about the first crash, it brought back, having seen that video, the MCAS software took control of the planes and brought them down. And it was the same issue of a faulty sensor. Both Boeing and Airbus had created software that overrode the decisions of skilled pilots. And to me, that is just a horrible issue. I mean, yes, we have seen at least one instance where a pilot decided to commit suicide and flew his plane into the sea. We know that. And fly-by-wire is the safety envelope is a good thing. But you cannot, when ultimately, I don't believe you can or should take control away from skilled operators. And I think that's true with cars as well. And I suspect that one of the reasons that we still don't see a fully autonomous car is because nobody has been able to come up with sufficiently sophisticated AI to make the kinds of decisions, multiple decisions and micro decisions that we all make, even those of us who are terrible drivers, that we all make without thinking, just below our consciousness, because it's the trained instinct of a skilled person. And that is, of course, is true for pilots. Okay, so, is it all gloom? I've given you a lot of gloom here. Of course it's not. Of course it's not all gloom, or we wouldn't be here. I'm in love with tech still after more than 40 years. That bright promise of technology that enhances and enables human creativity and human capability, I think is a great dream. And we do have software that does that. We have robots that do that. We have robot surgery that's been very successful. We have all kinds of wonderful software. Some of you may be using AI in your testing. Some of you may be testing AI. There's lots of, we know, fantastic stuff out there, including this, that AI was used to go through the huge amounts of data that was necessary to understand the full protein structure of COVID-19 and to come up with vaccines for it. And they were able to develop those vaccines in such an accelerated pace because of that idea. So no, of course it's not all gloom. But the potential for gloom is out there. There is a lot of stuff that we need to start taking a different view of. I started this whole journey because one day I was reading an online newspaper with my breakfast, as you do, and I came upon an article that said that somebody had created an algorithm that looked at images of people and detected whether they were gay or straight. And apart from thinking, who would do such a thing? My immediate reaction was, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, think about that. Think of the repressive regimes where homosexuality is outlawed. Think of how that will be misused. And why would you do it? Why would you create such an algorithm? Beats me. So I do think there are things we can do. I think we start by saying it isn't necessarily a technology problem. Really, it's a people problem. The people who create technology, the people who use technology, the people who misuse technology. In the case of the post office people, there must have been an awful lot of people there who just looked the other way, who knew there were problems with their Horizon system, and yet, it's as much as my job's worth to make a fuss, or I just don't want to know. I want to retire nicely, and I didn't hear that. We know there are scammers, we know there are hackers, there are users, people who use systems in ways we never anticipated, and guess what? It created a serious problem. There are UX designers who create UI that is very difficult to use for people who have to make decisions in safety critical applications and have to make them fast. There are lots of problems out there. And by the way, you and me, we're all involved too. Some of you may have seen that I, a few years ago, did a keynote at another conference that I called 10+1 Commandments for Ethical Techies. I have some copies of the card here if you're interested. Please feel free to take one at the end of this talk. I may not have enough for everybody, but I may have more. But we do need to ground our technical practices on ethical thinking and ethical processes. We need to consider what we do in the light of our own ethics. And of course, we don't all think the same way. We don't all have the same ethical bottom line. But we should all know what our ethical bottom line is. And we should be working with that in mind. We need to acknowledge that tech has limitations. AI is not sentient, whatever that poor man at Google who finally got fired thought. Data is not knowledge. It's data. It's not even information a lot of the time. When I went to work on the project in the UK, it was a project that was bringing together, oh gosh, I can't remember, 59 systems. Many of them newly built or customized for the fire and rescue service across England. And one of the things that appealed to me about the project, apart from the fact that I thought it was going to be a monumental failure, and yes it was, it got canceled, was that I had elderly relatives in the UK. And the thought that my aunties would be subject to this system made me want to go and be the program test manager, so I was. But I read in their brochure that they were going to replace local knowledge with data. And that was one of their proudest boasts. And I thought, no, you cannot do that. You cannot substitute data for local knowledge. Of course, you can supplement it, but you have to have both. You can't replace people in that way. Software cannot replace the trained instincts of skilled humans. Now, there's software that runs without human interference. Process control systems, embedded systems in nuclear plants, and so on. Fine, that's good, all good. But in cases where human capability is operating, has operated, it does not make sense often to replace that with software, to try and assume that we can do it better with software than the people can do it themselves. And software certainly can't make moral or ethical decisions. We need to embrace human-centered computing, human agency, fostering human agency, human engagement with what they're doing. Ergonomics, and as I said earlier, UX and UI design. When we're developing products, we need to question the assumptions that have gone into them. The model, then the objective of this thing. Why are we building this system? What's it for? What model are we using? What are the decision criteria we're using? What proxy data are we using? Because often the data that's being used to make decisions is not even data that's directly about the decision itself. It's proxy data. The science that's informing AI decisions. It may or may not be science. It may be junk science. We need to look for biases in the data for sure, in the decision criteria, in the model, in any imaginable outcome. We need to use our imaginations. We need to use tools like fault trees and so on. For sure, we need to protect data. And we need to start, I think, by using a standard like privacy by design. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's a standard that was developed by, primarily by Anne Cavoukian, who was at one time Ontario's privacy commissioner. And it's been adopted by the EU as a privacy standard. And the initial premise of it is that you don't collect data you do not need. And you protect privacy always. That's just, you build that into your design, you build it into your application. And the same with security. There is also a security by design standard. I was saying to somebody the other day, or perhaps today, it's been a long day, that I have Bell Internet. And the admin login for my Bell Internet, the login ID and the password are, guess what? Admin. They don't tell you that when you buy their internet, when they install it. So I know that, and I know I should change it. I bet Peggy knows she should change it. I bet you do, Tina, and others. But how many other people do? That's insane. We need to consider the impacts of what we do to human society. we're not separate. We're part of human society. We need to care about that. We need to be sure that what we are doing is not doing harm, that it is doing good, that we are enabling humans. And we need to ask what could possibly go wrong at every step of the way. And sometimes we need to say, should we build this at all? Why would you build an algorithm that claims to detect whether somebody is gay or straight? What could possibly be the point of that? We are humans in society. And not just in our work, but in our relationships with other people, in our conversations with people who are not in tech. We need to, because we are knowledgeable, because we know that AI is not sentient, we know that junk science is being used, we need to help people understand that. Bring them into the conversation. Because in a lot of cases, people are being fooled, and they don't need to be. We can help that. We can debunk the AI snake oil. We can call out the fake science. We can resist surveillance, particularly when it's being applied to us, but when it's being applied to anybody, when it's being applied to your children. And let's not anthropomorphize tech. Let's not pretend that the robot is your teammate. It's not your teammate, it's a tool. It's a piece of software that was developed by people to serve people. It's not your buddy. It's just a tool. And that's all I have to say. Thank you all for listening. As I said, there are ethics cards up here if you would like one. I have a vast number of resources here if you'd like to read books about some of these subjects. I cannot pretend, I will not pretend to have read every one of them cover to cover, because I have not. Some I have read, some I have skimmed, and others I only know are good resources, including whistleblowing resources for people who find themselves in a position where they may need to be whistleblowers. Thank you.